During a blinding snowstorm, a lonely man sat in silence until a tiny fist knocked at his door. Outside, a shivering girl, tears frozen on her cheeks, whispered, "Please, my mom won't wake up." That single moment forced a choice, and what he did next would change both their lives forever. The storm hadn't let up in hours. From the top floor of his cliffside home, Garrett Stone stared at the snowfall through a wall of glass. Beyond the windows, white spirals churned across the black Atlantic like ghosts. Inside, everything was still, eerily still. The only sound was the low hum of his desk monitor, its cold blue light casting charts, profit curves, and shareholder graphs onto his sharp jawline. Beside the keyboard sat a heavy-bottomed glass with the last amber smear of whiskey drying at the edges. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that didn't relieve anything, just confirmed how long he'd been holding it. He hadn't spoken to a soul in almost 2 days, not unless you counted the quarterly board call where he'd spoken only when necessary, and even then, with the efficiency of a man who viewed conversation as bandwidth to be conserved. Somewhere out there, buried under layers of wind and frost, was Maple Harbor, Maine, a town Garrett technically lived in but hadn't really participated in for over a year. When you built fiber optic infrastructure and sold cloud architecture to government agencies, location became irrelevant. The house was glass, steel, and stone, custom built for a man with too much money and no one to share it with. He glanced down at the blinking cursor in the middle of a quarterly projection, a 7-figure surplus on screen, but all he felt was that old, familiar emptiness, the storm outside echoing it back. And then came the knock. Not a polite tap, a pounding, rapid, desperate. Garrett jolted, chair screeching against polished wood. For a split second, he thought it might be a branch slamming into the siding. But no, it came again. Harder, closer, a sound too human to mistake. He was already up, pulling on his coat before he even realized it. Feet hitting the stairs in a blur, heart hammering. When he opened the front door, the wind punched in like a beast unchained, flinging snow into his entryway, and standing in the middle of it was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6. Her cheeks were pale, lashes crusted with ice, blonde hair stuck in wet clumps to her face. She wore a torn pink dress, one sleeve missing, the fabric thin and stiff with cold. Her lips trembled, but her voice didn't break as she looked up at him and said, "Please, my mom won't wake up." Everything inside Garrett stilled. No numbers, no noise, just this. He knelt immediately, heart already racing. "Where is she?" he asked. "Next door," the girl said, voice hoarse. "I tried to wake her, but she was breathing weird." The heat stopped. The lights went out. He reached out and cupped her cheek. It was ice. Actual ice. Her skin didn't give at his touch, just stayed frozen under his palm. Garrett felt something sharp move through him, a kind of inner fracture. Without another word, he scooped her up into his arms. "I'm Garrett," he said, wrapping his coat around her. "You hang on tight." She didn't answer, just held on, her little fists tangled in his shirt collar. "What's your name?" "Piper," she whispered. "And your mom's?" "Naomi." The snow was knee-high in places. The wind clawed at his face. But Garrett didn't stop moving. The duplex was only 50 feet from his driveway, part of the old coastal development he'd bought out 5 years ago and left to management. He'd driven past it 100 times, never once looked inside. Until now. The door wasn't locked. Inside was pitch dark, except for the eerie blue flicker of a dying space heater. The air was heavy, thick with gas and something worse. He found her on the floor beside the couch. Early 20s, pale, shivering, breathing shallow and sharp like each breath hurt. Her arm was draped over a blanket, fingers limp. The room smelled like metal and damp fabric. The furnace was dead. There was no insulation worth mentioning. Garrett laid the girl, Piper, on the cleanest part of the carpet and pulled his phone from his coat. 911, he told them. I have a woman unconscious from exposure. Carbon monoxide likely. Address is 7 Cliff Row, Maple Harbor. I'm moving them now. He picked Piper back up, then bent down and carefully lifted the woman. She was lighter than she should have been. Malnourished, bones beneath skin. Hold on, he said, mostly to himself. By the time he reached his front door again, blue lights were cutting through the trees. Paramedics swarmed his walkway, taking the woman onto a gurney. One of them paused, surprised, when he saw Garrett carrying the child. She came to me, Garrett explained. She saved her mom. The medic nodded, gently taking Piper and wrapping her in thermal blankets. Smart kid. As they loaded Naomi, he'd heard her name from Piper, into the back of the ambulance. Garrett stood frozen in the doorway, snow melting on his shoulders, breath steaming in short, uneven clouds. Piper was bundled safely now, but her eyes stayed locked on his, wide, glassy, full of something wordless. Gratitude, maybe, or fear, or both. He didn't realize how long he'd been standing there until the lights started to fade down the hill. Then, just as he turned to go back inside, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Across the drive near the tree line stood a man in a dark, hooded parka. No visible expression, just watching, not moving, not offering help. And then, gone. The snow swallowed him. Garrett stared for a long moment. He hadn't believed in omens before tonight, but something had changed, and nothing was going back. The emergency room lights were too bright, white, sterile, and humming with a cold that Garrett Stone couldn't quite shake, even after the blizzard. Naomi lay unconscious in a private room, warmed by heated blankets and a slow drip of intravenous line fluids. Monitors blinked steadily beside her bed, their beeps strangely soothing in the otherwise quiet space. Garrett sat in a plastic chair, stiff and unused to waiting. His coat was still damp from the storm. Piper was curled beside him on the vinyl love seat, blanketed in hospital fleece, her small form barely denting the cushions. She hadn't spoken since they'd arrived. But her hand, it remained gripped to his coat sleeve with quiet intensity, as if letting go would mean losing everything. She didn't cry, didn't ask questions, just held on. That silent trust unnerved Garrett more than a boardroom of hostile investors. The pressure of her fingers, so small, so steady, cut through him like no financial forecast ever had. He glanced down at her. Her cheeks were flushed now from warmth rather than cold, her lashes longer than he'd noticed in the stormlight. She looked like she belonged somewhere safe, not in an ER because the system had failed her. A soft knock at the doorway broke the silence. A nurse stepped in, clipboard in hand. She's stable, she said, nodding toward Naomi. Carbon monoxide exposure and mild hypothermia. She was lucky Garrett didn't feel lucky. She can probably be discharged tomorrow with observation, the nurse continued, but you'll want to prepare for a visit from social services. Cases like this, they usually trigger mandatory reviews. His jaw tightened. Understood. But his eyes remained on Piper. Not long after, footsteps approached from the hallway, louder, heavier. A man entered without knocking, a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. snow still clinging to the shoulders of his utility jacket. Garrett recognized him instantly from the shadows the night before. Mason Crow. "Hey there," Mason said with mock casualness. "Just came to check in on Miss Lane." Shame what happened. Place went out at the worst time. Piper's grip on Garrett's sleeve stiffened. Garrett stood slowly, body instinctively tensing. "You're the property manager?" Mason nodded. "Harbor Ridge LLC. I oversee maintenance and leases. We've got a process, but it slipped through the cracks, I guess." He offered a tight smile, then pulled out a thin folder. "To make things easier, we've got a non-disclosure and lease cancellation ready to go. You know, so we can move forward without the press breathing down everyone's neck." He held the file out. Garrett didn't take it. "She nearly died," he said evenly. "You handed her a death sentence and now you want her to sign it away?" Mason shrugged. "Look, I don't write the contracts. I just move things along. If she sues, the company'll tie her up in court for years. This is cleaner. And frankly, cheaper for everyone." Garrett's fingers clenched. Without breaking eye contact, he took the file and tore it down the middle. "Get out," he said, voice calm but edged with fire. Mason's smile dropped. "You sure you want to do that, Mr. Stone? You know how the business works. Noise like this can echo through investors fast." "I said get out." The nurse reappeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're not family, Mr. Crow. You'll need to leave." Security stepped into the doorway. Mason lifted his hands like it was all a misunderstanding and backed out, eyes flicking to Piper before he disappeared. Piper exhaled, her first sound in minutes. Garrett sat back down, chest tight. The hospital buzzed around them. Intercom beeps, wheels squeaking, a faint lullaby playing overhead for a newborn down the hall. But none of it grounded him the way Piper's grip on his coat did. Later that evening, Garrett returned home. The cold clinging to his clothes despite the blast of heat from his geothermal system. He stood by the window wall of his study, gazing out into the gray, snow-covered coastline. His cliffside mansion was immaculate. Stone floors, glass panels, recessed lighting glowing like a magazine spread. But it felt lifeless. Unmoored. Then his phone buzzed. Troy Ellison, CFO Shark, the voice of capital. Garrett sighed and picked up. "You know you're on the front page of the Local?" Troy said without preamble. "You playing hero now?" "It wasn't about public relations," Garrett replied flatly. "Well, it's becoming one." Local news stations picked up the ER report. "Millionaire neighbor rescues single mom from frozen duplex." Hell of a headline. "Troy?" "Listen," Troy cut in, voice clipped. "You want to cover her bills? Fine. But don't get sentimental. That property's under Harbor Ridge, which means Stone Harbor Holdings, which means you. If this gets lit up, it's not just a human interest piece. It's a liability. Investors will ask if you've lost control." Garrett stared at the fireless hearth across the room. "Maybe I did. Maybe that's the problem." Troy didn't laugh. "Touch this and the street will eat you alive. You built a clean structure for a reason. Don't blow it open now." The call ended. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Minutes later, Garrett was back at the hospital. Not in a private wing, not in a PR suit. Just standing outside Naomi's room in the same coat Piper had clung to. A code officer was now waiting at the nurse's station. She greeted him with a clipboard and the kind of forced smile that came with bureaucracy. "You're listed as the contact for Miss Lane?" Garrett nodded. "We've conducted an emergency inspection of the duplex. Furnace failure, gas leak, Insulation well below minimum code. That unit, and 3 others, should have been condemned. We'll be filing formal violations with the IMO LLC. He looked her in the eyes. That's not going to be necessary. She raised an eyebrow. Because I'm assuming responsibility, he said. The shell company, the LLC, the management group, they all roll up to me. And that makes this mine to fix behind him. Piper appeared in the hallway. She didn't speak, just walked up and slipped her hand into his again. He didn't flinch. He looked down at her hand, and for the first time in years, something real shifted inside him. Not guilt, not shame. Resolve. That night, as they stepped out into the snow again, the blizzard had calmed to a gentle fall. Piper didn't let go of his sleeve. She didn't need to say anything. He already knew. He wasn't just holding her hand anymore. He was holding a line, and this time, he wouldn't let go. The next morning, the storm had softened to flurries. Naomi had been discharged at first light after overnight observation. The attending asked them to come back that afternoon for a quick follow-up. The sky hung low and heavy above Maple Harbor, the sea still shrouded in pale mist. Garrett stood at the threshold of his guest house, holding a fresh cup of coffee, the scent of oak and espresso mingling in the air. His breath clouded in the cold, but inside, warmth bloomed. Piper sat at the edge of the guest room couch, wearing a knit sweater one of the nurses had given her and socks that sagged at her ankles. Naomi was asleep in the bedroom, her breathing steady now, her skin no longer pale with the blue tint of the night before. The entire space had been transformed, quiet, clean, safe. Garrett had made sure of it himself, removing every hint of cold, sealing the window edges, adjusting the thermostat so the heat never dipped below 70. The moment Piper stepped into his house last night, the contrast between her world and his had become blinding. He watched her now as she leaned over a steaming mug of cocoa, hands wrapped tightly around it. Her blonde hair still held the slightest curl from sleep. There was a calm to her posture that hadn't been there in the hospital. Stillness, not born of fear but rest. The scent of damp wool and old smoke still clung faintly to her coat in the hallway. It was a scent Garrett now associated with injustice, one he couldn't shake from his mind. He sat across from her and passed over a small plate with toast. "You hungry?" She nodded but didn't answer. She took a bite and chewed quietly. Then, eyes still on her plate, she whispered, "It doesn't smell like our house." "What does it smell like?" She looked up. "Warm? Like wood and coffee?" Not moldy socks, Garrett almost smiled, but the weight of her words settled too deeply for that. A few hours later, Naomi emerged from the guest room, her hair tied back, still looking fragile but present. Her voice was soft, cracking at the edges. "You didn't have to bring us here." Garrett stood from the kitchen counter, where he'd been scanning property records on his tablet. "I did. And I'm glad I did." Naomi's hands wrung the hem of the sweater she wore, borrowed from one of the staff at the hospital. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You deserve better." That's all. She glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the solid pine walls, the recessed lighting, the quiet hum of the heater. It's been a long time since Piper felt safe anywhere. Garrett hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask what happened?" Naomi nodded slowly. "We moved here 2 years ago. I took the first job I could get, laundry room at Harbor Light Motel. It's barely above minimum wage and they pay cash, always late. I didn't complain, not once. Because I knew if I did, Mason would evict us." She looked down. Last winter, our heat cut out for 3 days. I begged him to send someone. He told me to stop causing problems. Garrett's hands curled into fists at his sides. Naomi's voice trembled. I worked doubles. Saved what I could. But rent went up. And when I fell behind, he came knocking. Said I needed to cooperate if I wanted a roof over Piper's head. Her eyes hardened. I locked the door. He left a space heater outside with a note. That's what we used that night. Garrett felt the shame crawl up his spine. Every inch of comfort he lived in, his minimalist kitchen, his unobtrusive automation, his stock portfolio, was built on clean numbers. Numbers he had never questioned. He'd never looked into the guts of Harbor Ridge LLC. That wasn't his job. Delegation kept the empire running. But now he saw the names attached to line items, the weight of what his indifference had enabled. The doorbell rang. He crossed the house and opened the door to find Jenna Morales standing there, a legal aid attorney from the Maple Harbor Justice Center, bundled in a navy peacoat, her cheeks pink from the cold. You don't know me, she said, flashing a badge clipped to her collar. But I'm here because 3 tenants from the Harbor Ridge properties reported being threatened if they talk to the press. I know Naomi Lane is staying here. Garrett stepped aside. She is. Jenna walked in, her eyes flicking across the pristine interior like she didn't quite believe it. I'm not here to play politics, she said. I'm here because someone needs to put Mason Crow and his bosses under a microscope. Garrett didn't correct her. Not yet. Jenna spotted Naomi sitting on the couch, Piper beside her. I came to check on you, she said gently. You're not alone. Not anymore, Naomi nodded, voice thin. I didn't sign anything. Good, Jenna replied. Because the gag orders they've been pushing are illegal under state housing law. Garrett stepped forward. What happens next? I'm building a case. I have maintenance logs from 3 other tenants that show falsified repair dates, and I just got a tip that there are carbon monoxide complaints that were never logged with the city. Just buried. Garrett looked at her, the decision crystallizing. If I told you that I have access to internal documents from the ownership side, emails, property records, would that help? Jenna raised an eyebrow. Who are you exactly? He hesitated. I'm Garrett Stone, CEO of Glacier Point Networks. And until this morning, I also technically own Harbor Ridge. The air went still. Jenna blinked once, slowly. You're the landlord. I'm the man who didn't know what his money was doing, Garrett corrected. But I do now. And I want to help fix it. For a long beat, Jenna studied him, then nodded. If you're serious, I'll hold you to shit. An hour later, Garrett returned to his office upstairs. Lydia, his executive assistant, was already on video call. I pulled the internal structure, she said. Harbor Ridge LLC is under Stone Harbor Holdings, which is owned 98% through Glacier Point Private Assets Division. That's your shell, Garrett. You've got authority to pull every record, do it, he said. I want everything. Maintenance logs, payments, non-disclosure agreements. Don't filter anything. As the call ended, Garrett walked to the edge of his floor-to-ceiling window. The storm was clearing now, sunlight trying to push through the clouds. The sea rolled in slow, slate-colored waves. On the stone wall just outside his gate, an envelope had been wedged between the wrought iron. Garrett stepped into the cold and pulled it free. Inside was a USB drive. No name, no message. He plugged it in. A shaky video played. A basement door. Mason's voice cursing. A chain clinking. A child sobbing. The screen froze on a frame that showed Mason padlocking the handle. The timestamp was just 4 days ago. Garrett stared at the screen until his reflection in the monitor sharpened and looked back at him. Cold, corporate, clean. "No more hiding," he said aloud. And this time, he meant it. He forwarded the footage to Detective Briggs and Jenna, then mirrored it to a time-stamped cloud link for verification at dawn. By morning, the town wasn't guessing anymore. It had proof. The following morning, Maple Harbor awoke to silence. Not the hush of snow, but the tense quiet that follows revelation. The video had changed everything. Garrett stood at the edge of the conference room inside Glacier Point headquarters, a modern glass-paneled structure overlooking the harbor. The room was built for confidence. Brushed steel chairs, a 10-foot table carved from reclaimed oak, a full wall of screens, and a polished credenza stocked with untouched bottles of imported water. But this morning, the setting felt more like a war room. He didn't sit. The chairs around the table filled slowly with department heads, legal counsel, and 2 members of the board. At the head of the table, Troy Ellison adjusted his cufflinks and gave Garrett a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Garrett tossed the printed still from the USB video onto the center of the table. "I assume you've all seen this." No one replied, but a few shifted in their seats. "This footage was left anonymously at my home," Garrett continued. "It shows Mason Crow, the property manager of Harbor Ridge, chaining a basement door shut while a child cries on the other side. A beat. We now have proof that our LLC is responsible for systemic violations of safety, habitability, and possibly criminal negligence. This is not just a PR problem. It's a moral failure, and we fix it from the top down." Troy leaned back, fingers steepled. "Garrett, I sympathize. I really do. But you're reacting emotionally. This is a firestorm, and the smart move is to isolate the damage. We spin off Harbor Ridge, let Crow take the heat, pay out settlements if needed. Quiet ones. That's how you insulate the core brand?" Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You want me to throw Mason under the bus and pretend the rest of us weren't standing behind the wheel?" Troy spread his hands. "Business is structure. That's the whole point of holding companies and management firms. We don't need to tear down the tower just because one brick was rotten." Garrett walked around the table slowly, the silence heavy behind him. He stopped at the windows, looking out over the town. "You ever stood in a frozen apartment with no heat, Troy?" No answer. "Held a child's hand while her mother fights to breathe because some guy you've never met thought cutting corners on a gas line was worth a 5% margin bump?" Nothing. Garrett turned back to the room. "We're freezing all rent collection on Harbor Ridge properties, effective immediately. Every tenant gets rehoused in safe, code-compliant units or hotels until full inspections are complete. Starting today, legal counsel stirred. Garrett," he held up a hand, "and before you say it, I know exactly what it will cost. Millions. Possibly more if this goes federal. But if we don't act, we deserve what's coming." Troy stood, lips tight. "You're exposing us to massive liability. You're admitting guilt." "I'm accepting responsibility," Garrett corrected. Big difference. The boardroom fell quiet. Outside, the gray clouds over the harbor thickened again. That afternoon, Garrett took Naomi and Piper back to the hospital for a brief follow-up. Already discharged, Naomi walked a slow lap through the rehab wing beside Piper, bundled in one of the puffer jackets Garrett had sent earlier. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though she still moved carefully, her steps had strength in them now. Piper spotted Garrett before her mother did and sprinted ahead, her boots thudding on the polished floor. "You came back," she said, breathless. Garrett crouched, meeting her eye level. "Of course I did." Naomi reached them a moment later. She looked wary, guarded. "Everything okay?" Before he could answer, a voice echoed from the hallway behind them. "Naomi Lane?" They turned. Mason Crow strode toward them, wearing a smug half-smile and a freshly pressed coat. He carried a clipboard, just like always. "You don't answer your door, so I figured I'd find you here," he said smoothly. "We still need to settle your lease, Naomi. Can't have you squatting under Mr. Stone's charity forever." Naomi's face drained of color. Piper moved behind Garrett instinctively. "I already told you," Naomi said, voice shaking. "I'm not signing anything." Mason took another step closer, lowering his voice. "You sign, you walk away. Don't make this hard. You push this, and maybe someone from social services starts asking why a little girl was left alone in a duplex with no heat." Garrett stepped forward. "Say that again," he said coldly. Mason blinked, as if just noticing him. "Garrett, look, man, I'm just trying to keep things smooth." "No, you're trying to cover your tracks." Garrett's voice sharpened. "You threatened a mother. You endangered a child. And now you think you're still operating under the old rules." But those are gone. Naomi's eyes, just seconds ago filled with dread, shifted. Her shoulders lifted slightly. Her gaze moved from Mason to Garrett and held. Not just a neighbor anymore, a protector. Mason glanced around the hallway, now full of curious eyes. His smirk faltered. "Fine," he muttered, backing away. "You'll regret this." As he disappeared down the corridor, Naomi turned to Garrett. "I didn't think anyone would ever stand up to him." Garrett looked at her, something heavy forming behind his chest. "You don't have to be afraid of men like that anymore." They left the hospital in silence, the cold outside biting at their coats. Garrett helped Naomi into the SUV, then turned to buckle Piper in. The little girl looked up at him with steady blue eyes. "Are we going home?" Garrett paused. "We're going somewhere safe." Back at the house, Garrett passed through the foyer and into his study. Lydia was already there, her laptop open, eyes focused. "I've gone through the maintenance records," she said. "You were right to suspect something. Mason's vendor list is a front. Half the receipts are fabricated, and the ones that aren't show charges for work never done." She turned the screen toward him. "But there's more." An open spreadsheet, columns highlighted red, a quiet paper trail of cash payouts listed under vague consulting fees, kickbacks. "How far up does it go?" Garrett asked. Lydia hesitated. "The approval chain ends with Troy." He signed off on everything. Before Garrett could respond, his phone buzzed. Detective Alonzo Briggs. He picked up. "We just received a packet of documents," Briggs said. "Anonymous source. Handwritten ledgers mapping internal repairs and payouts. All linked to Harbor Ridge." He paused. "This thing's about to blow wide open." Garrett looked out the window. The sea had calmed, but the sky was still dark, thick with unshed snow. "Then we'd better be ready." The scent of cinnamon and brown sugar drifted through Garrett Stone's once sterile home, softening every edge. In the pre-dawn quiet, the fireplace crackled faintly, casting a golden flicker across the polished floorboards. Somewhere down the hall, the low hum of Naomi's voice mixed with Piper's laughter as they huddled in the kitchen, pulling cookies from the oven like it was the most natural thing in the world. A tiny blue toy car sat under Garrett's coffee table, half hidden by a blanket Piper had dragged there to make a fort. Just a week ago, this house had echoed with silence. Now, warmth had arrived not just in temperature, but in presence. The kind that filled the air, made rooms feel occupied, even when no one was in them. Garrett stood by the window, coffee mug warming his palms, watching the snow dust the pine trees outside. He'd spent his entire adult life designing systems, building networks, watching numbers rise and fall like tides. And yet here, now, everything that mattered wasn't measured in spreadsheets or profit margins. It was measured in the way a child laughed in her sleep, the way Naomi tucked her hair behind her ear while reading a recipe off her phone, the way his home finally felt like something lived in. His eyes drifted back to the toy car, then to the open laptop on his counter. 2 emails waited, one from legal, the other from PR. He ignored both. Instead, he let the silence linger, savoring what it meant to choose connection over quarterly wins. At precisely 9 a.m., Garrett arrived at the Maple County Family and Housing Court, dressed not in his usual sharp navy suit, but in a charcoal sweater and black wool coat. Beside him walked Naomi, shoulders squared despite the anxiety in her eyes, and Piper, holding both their hands, her tiny backpack swinging with each determined step. The courthouse was already packed. Jenna Morales met them at the entrance, clipboard in hand, her jaw tight. Standing room only inside. Reporters, housing advocates, even a few Glacier Point investors. Naomi hesitated. All those people, they're here for us? Jenna nodded. And for everyone else who never got the chance to be heard. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Rows of benches overflowed with townspeople, former tenants, and media figures. Judge Ruth Ellery presided from the bench, her reputation well known across the state, fair but unrelenting. She adjusted her reading glasses as the bailiff called the hearing to order. Jenna took the floor first, her tone precise and unflinching. Your Honor, today we ask for emergency protection orders for Ms. Naomi Lane and her daughter Piper, and for the court to authorize a full-scale inspection of the Harbor Ridge properties, owned through Stone Harbor Holdings and controlled by Mr. Garrett Stone. A quiet ripple moved through the room as Garrett's name was spoken aloud. Jenna continued, We have verified reports of carbon monoxide, exposure, uninsulated living conditions, forged repair records, and intimidation tactics used against tenants who spoke out. One of those tenants sits here today, alive because her daughter braved a snowstorm and found help. She nodded gently toward Piper, who sat quietly beside Naomi, hands folded over her bunny plush. Across the aisle, Kara Whitfield, outside counsel for Glacier Point, rose with all the polished confidence of a seasoned litigator. Her expression was calm, cool, even sympathetic. Your Honor, she began, we recognize the hardship Ms. Lane endured, but the defense will show that this was an unfortunate, isolated incident involving a single bad actor, Mr. Mason Crow, who has since been terminated. Ms. Lane had a history of late rent, failed to report maintenance issues through formal channels, and has no documented employment on record. The facts do not support a systemic failure, Garrett exhaled slowly. So there it was, the script. The narrative Kara would spin like clockwork. Discredit the victim, isolate the perpetrator, preserve the structure. Judge Ellery lifted an eyebrow. And Mr. Stone? Does he speak for himself? Garrett stood. Yes, Your Honor. He walked calmly to the center of the room, every eye on him. I want to be clear. Ms. Lane reported issues multiple times. She was silenced by fear that if she spoke up, she and her daughter would be on the street. That fear was justified. Harbor Ridge was a structure built on deferral, avoidance, and plausible deniability. I didn't just fail to stop it. I helped design the system that allowed it. Gasps murmured across the benches. Kara rose instantly. Objection. That's speculative. Mr. Stone cannot admit to liability for an entire company's operations in a housing hearing. Judge Ellery held up a hand, silencing her. Continue, Mr. Stone. Garrett nodded. I've ordered an internal audit of every unit. I've frozen rent collection and begun rehousing tenants in hotels while independent inspectors do their work. And I've turned over internal communications, including records that show signatures were applied to maintenance deferments while I was out of state. He turned to Naomi and Piper. This happened on my watch. It won't happen again. Jenna approached the bench. We request an immediate ruling to authorize full access to Harbor Ridge properties for inspection and protective oversight for Ms. Lane and her daughter. Judge Ellery leaned back in her chair. She looked at Naomi, then at Piper, and finally at Garrett. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but firm. This court grants temporary legal safeguards for Ms. Lane and her daughter, including housing protection and no-contact orders against Mr. Crow or any agents of Harbor Ridge. Furthermore, I am issuing a court-backed warrant for inspection of all properties owned under Stone Harbor Holdings, effective immediately. Whispers broke out again. Garrett closed his eyes briefly, not in regret, but in relief. The judge continued. Mr. Stone, I commend your willingness to accept responsibility. But if there's a trail of negligence, we'll follow it to the very top. Make no mistake, he nodded once. I wouldn't expect otherwise. As the hearing adjourned, Garrett moved to leave, but Lydia caught him by the arm just outside the chamber. Her face was pale, eyes wide, tablet clutched to her chest. Garrett, I found something. She turned the screen toward him. A string of auto-stamped digital approvals tied to Harbor Ridge maintenance waivers. All bore Garrett's e-signature, time-stamped during his international trip last quarter. They were queued by Troy's document automation system, she whispered. The approvals were pushed through while you were 12 time zones away. Garrett's stomach dropped. They've been trying to pin this on you, she said, from the start. He looked past her to the courthouse steps, where reporters now clustered, cameras waiting. Naomi stood with Piper at the edge of the crowd. The girl waved, the sunlight catching her mitten. For a moment, nothing else existed. Then Garrett turned back to Lydia. Get me everything, he said. Every signature, every file, every piece of this. Because now he wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting to clear the path for it. The courtroom was different this time. It wasn't the lighting or the temperature. It was the air itself. Dense, expectant. Like the entire room had inhaled but forgotten how to exhale. Everyone was there. Tenants, reporters, city officials, even a few faces from state housing agencies. Garrett sat beside Naomi and Piper, hands clasped, back straight, pulse thrumming like an internal metronome. Naomi was calm on the surface, but her fingers twitched now and then, resting gently on Piper's knee. And Piper was still. Unnervingly still. Judge Ruth Ellery stepped into the room with her usual no-nonsense stride, glasses already perched on the bridge of her nose. She settled into her chair, then scanned the room with the quiet gravity of someone who had seen too many excuses in her lifetime. Let's continue, she said simply. Ms. Morales, you may proceed. Jenna stood. Your Honor, we would like to call Piper Lane. There was a hush, full, sharp, and sudden. All eyes shifted to the little girl as she rose, holding her bunny plush tightly under one arm. She wore a pale blue dress and wool tights, her blonde hair pinned back neatly, a hand-me-down bow tied just off-center. The bailiff asked if she would tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Piper nodded. Then she climbed into the witness chair, her feet swinging several inches above the floor. Jenna approached, her tone gentle. "Piper, can you tell us what happened the night your mom got sick?" Piper swallowed. Her voice was soft, so soft it almost didn't seem real, but it didn't waver. "It was cold," she said. "Really cold. And the heater made the air smell weird. Mommy wouldn't wake up. So I put on my shoes and went outside." "And what did you do next?" Piper looked straight at the judge. "I knocked because I thought the cold would take Mommy," he answered. She turned her gaze to Garrett. The room didn't just quiet, it stilled. Even the creak of shifting benches faded. Somewhere in the back row, someone sniffled quietly. The silence after her words felt sacred. Then, like a subtle current, something shifted in the room. Shoulders lowered, tension cracked. Not relief exactly, just truth finally spoken out loud. From the bench, Judge Ellery blinked once, then looked down as if to anchor herself. Naomi's hand squeezed tightly around Piper's. And Garrett. Garrett couldn't move. His throat clenched with a feeling he didn't recognize at first. Not guilt, not shame, but something sharper and cleaner. Pride. Not the kind that comes from profit margins or awards. The kind that bloomed only when you saw someone do something pure and right and brave. Jenna gave Piper a small smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. That was very brave." Piper slid down from the chair and returned to her mother's arms. Garrett reached over and gently touched her shoulder. No words. Just warmth passed from one hand to another. The next to take the stand was Lydia Harlow. She walked with quiet resolve, dressed in a navy suit and carrying a stack of documents like they were artillery. Her voice, when she spoke, was precise. "I'm the executive assistant to Mr. Garrett Stone. I conducted an internal audit following the allegations raised in this courtroom. What I found was a digital signature automation system set up by CFO Troy Ellison. The system queued e-signatures for safety repair deferments, all appearing under Mr. Stone's name while he was traveling out of the country. She placed copies of time-stamped approvals on the evidence table, each one showing a different date and Garrett's auto-stamped sign-off. These signatures, she added, were executed by the system Troy had configured to avoid executive delays. They were never manually approved. Jenna stepped forward. "Were these safety deferments material?" "Yes. Gas leak reports, carbon monoxide complaints, mold removal requests. All denied or delayed through that system." Judge Ellery took her time reading the documents. Her jaw tightened. "Thank you, Miss Harlow. Detective Briggs?" The courtroom doors opened as Detective Alonzo Briggs stepped in, with 2 uniformed officers and a banker's box filled with files. "Your Honor," he began, "the Maple Harbor PD has received anonymous ledgers from an internal whistleblower. These include basement logs, showing unauthorized padlocking of mechanical rooms, gas meter anomalies, and contractor invoices billed for repairs that were never completed." He handed the files to the clerk. "We are launching a full criminal investigation into Harbor Ridge LLC and its management, including Mr. Ellison." Garrett felt Naomi exhale next to him. Her hand found Piper's again. Judge Ellery leaned back in her chair, silent for a long beat. "Based on the testimony and evidence submitted today," she said, "this court formally grants protective status for Ms. Lane and her daughter. Additionally, I am ordering emergency inspections of all Harbor Ridge properties and referring the financial records to the State Attorney General's office for further review." The gavel struck once. sharp, final. But the story wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Garrett stepped into the wind, Naomi and Piper behind him, Jenna at his side. Reporters surged forward shouting questions. Garrett raised his hand. Then, he stepped in front of the microphones and didn't read from notes. Didn't defer to counsel. "My name is Garrett Stone," he said. "I built a company that changed the way people connect. But I failed to look close to home. I failed to see that the same systems I trusted to build were being used to exploit and endanger families." He looked directly into the cameras. "If my company failed families, that's on me. And if we're going to fix it, it won't be through PR statements or closed-door settlements. It'll be in daylight, in front of you, step by step. Or I don't deserve this job." He turned and walked down the courthouse steps. Behind him, a sharp shout cut through the wind. "Mason Crow's gone!" A patrol officer jogged up to Detective Briggs, breath visible in the cold. "He skipped out on his check-in this morning. Left his truck in a supermarket lot." "Cells off," Briggs swore under his breath. "Get units on every outbound road. He's in flight." The storm outside was over, but another one had begun. Garrett looked toward the harbor, wind catching his coat. This wasn't the end, but it was justice. Finally, painfully, starting to move. The wind had changed, still cold and sharp, but with a sense of retreat, as if the worst had passed. He was at the precinct when they brought Mason Crow in. His parka half-zipped, hair disheveled, and the last traces of arrogance stripped clean from his face. He looked smaller than Garrett remembered. Not physically, but in presence. Like a man who had run out of bluffs. Detective Briggs handed over Mason's phone without ceremony. "He ditched it, but we traced it. Contents were encrypted, but our team cracked it." Garrett scrolled through the files, text messages threatening tenants, internal chat logs with vague promises of quiet payoffs, and one unmistakable image. The photo of the chained basement door, time-stamped just days before Piper had knocked. Then came the message that shifted everything. "Troy says bury the carbon monoxide complaints. Mark them low priority and defer to next quarter. Use Garrett's stamp. He won't notice." Briggs said it flatly. "He flipped," said Troy. Ellison was behind the automation and signed off on all the repairs. "Mason's just the muscle. Troy's the one who gave him cover." Garrett's mouth was dry, but his voice was steady. "Then we go after Troy." By midday, Troy Ellison had resigned, not just from Glacier Point, but from every board seat he held across Garrett's portfolio. His name was scrubbed from public statements. His office emptied in less than an hour. The legal team, which had once shielded him with jargon and structure, had gone silent. That afternoon, Garrett stood once again before Judge Ellery, who reviewed the latest evidence in silence. Gas reports that had been altered, maintenance logs backdated, tenant complaints resolved in the system but never acted upon. Lydia's forensic audit of the auto-signature system made the final piece of the puzzle unignorable. Kara Whitfield didn't fight this time. She sat with folded hands, quiet and rigid, her earlier confidence drained. Judge Ellery didn't waste words. "The court admits all evidence: the carbon monoxide logs, forged invoices, e-signature forensics, and video surveillance. The suppression motion is denied. Any further obstruction will result in sanctions outside the courthouse." The media swarmed for reactions, but Garrett walked past them. He had nothing to sell anymore. No angle, just responsibility. Inside the safety of his car, he didn't reach for his phone. He stared ahead in silence. That night, he walked through his house slowly. He found Naomi in the kitchen, heating soup. She wore an old Glacier Point sweatshirt he didn't even remember owning. Her face was flushed from the warmth, her sleeves pushed up. "Everything okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Mason's in custody." Troy resigned. The judge admitted everything. She set the spoon down gently. "So it's over." Garrett shook his head. "No, but it's finally begun." And so the rebuilding started, not just in courtrooms or spreadsheets, but in the rooms of his own home. In the guest house, there were signs of life where silence had once reigned. Piper's crayon sunrise was now taped proudly to the fridge door. Beside it, a drawing of 3 stick figures, one tall with black hair, one with freckles, one very small holding a star, stood under a house with a crooked chimney. Beneath it, Piper had written in big block letters, SAFE. There was a cubby shelf near the entryway now, and one slot bore Piper's name and a paper label she had written herself. Her boots sat there, always muddied but lined up straight. Her toys were stacked in open baskets, not hidden in bags or tucked under beds. This was what safety looked like. Not perfection, consistency. Later, Garrett stood with Jenna Morales in the old boardroom of Stone Harbor Holdings. The glass wall that once symbolized corporate invincibility now reflected something else: transparency. He took a breath. "I want the entire real estate division dissolved and restructured under public audit," he said. "We'll rename it. Open every ledger. Build in third-party oversight." Jenna folded her arms. "Words are nice. What about power?" "2 layers," he said. "A tenant council, with elected residents holding veto power over safety cuts, and an external community panel you'll co-chair with Detective Briggs. One guards the inside, the other shines light from the outside." She blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" Garrett nodded. "Every quarter. Open meetings. Nothing off record. If this structure can't exist with sunlight on it, then it shouldn't exist at all." Jenna considered. "You're going to make enemies." "I've had worse." By evening, Naomi and Piper were back in the guest house, curled up on the couch under a flannel blanket, a mug of warm cider in Naomi's hands, and a stack of picture books in Piper's lap. The air smelled faintly of apples and cinnamon again. Garrett passed by the open door and paused. Piper looked up. "Want to read with us?" He stepped inside, took a seat on the floor, and leaned against the couch. Naomi handed him a book without a word, and Piper scooted closer. He read until she fell asleep against her mother's side, the bunny plush nestled under her chin. Then, long after the house had gone quiet, Garrett stood at the front door, watching the night. For the first time in weeks, the sky was clear. Stars blinked above the harbor. The wind had gone gentle, the first break in the storm. Behind him, Piper's drawing still clung to the fridge. And tomorrow, just beyond this stillness, Judge Ellery would return with her final orders. But tonight was theirs. By the time Judge Ellery's final ruling was handed down, the storm had long passed, but its mark remained. The courthouse steps glistened beneath a pale winter sun, and the world, it seemed, had exhaled. Mason Crowe pled guilty. The charges were stacked high: reckless endangerment, obstruction of justice, intimidation of tenants, falsifying inspection records. The most damning piece, his own photograph of the chained basement door, had sealed it. There would be no plea deal, no soft exit. His sentence was firm. For once, the consequences matched the harm. Harbor Ridge, now unmasked as the slumlord shell it had become, faced sweeping civil penalties. The court ordered full federal oversight, a top-down rehab of all 62 rental units across the state, and the creation of a tenants' protection trust funded directly from prior profits. For Naomi Lane, the judgment was more than legal. It was personal justice. She was offered a stabilized long-term lease in the newly renovated duplex, or a full relocation package to a home of her choosing, complete with employment transition support and healthcare coverage for her and Piper. No more bouncing between corners of desperation. She chose to stay, for now. "We've earned our place here," she said. "It's time we live like we belong." At Glacier Point, the shockwaves didn't just force a cleanup, they sparked a reformation. Under Garrett's orders, the company launched a victims' equity fund, seeded with 7 figures. It wasn't charity, it was back pay. A quiet reckoning in dollars for every report ignored, every maintenance call deferred. From now on, quarterly audits measuring safety before profit would be published online for all stakeholders. Lydia Harlow was promoted to Chief Ethics Officer, the youngest in company history. And on a small raised platform at City Hall, Jenna Morales and Detective Briggs were announced as co-chairs of a permanent community review panel overseeing all Glacier Point housing investments. The announcement made headlines, but Garrett wasn't at the press conference. He was at the kitchen table, helping Piper pack her lunch. The sun finally showed its face in Maple Harbor. Snowbanks shrank into slush, gutters trickled, and the air had that particular crispness that hinted at something new. Garrett zipped up Piper's jacket, tucking her hair into the hood with quiet precision. As they stepped outside, she grabbed his gloved hand. They walked in silence, past houses still dusted with frost, their boots tapping rhythmically on the wet sidewalks. Piper looked up at him, eyes squinting in the golden light. "Thank you," she said softly, "for opening the door." Garrett stopped walking. It hit him, not like the pounding storm or boardroom ambushes, but gently, undeniably, like warmth on skin long accustomed to cold. His throat tightened. "You saved your mom when you knocked," he answered. "You saved a lot more than that." Across the street. Naomi joined them, waving as she hurried over in a new coat that actually fit. She looked healthier, stronger, her eyes alert and unshadowed. They walked together to the corner, 3 figures framed by the rising sun. Farther downtown, Jenna and Lydia reviewed inspection plans over coffee, debating the best way to include tenant representatives in oversight meetings. Progress, once stalled by policy and pride, had momentum now. Back at the house, Garrett stepped inside alone. The silence was no longer sterile. It had texture now. Muffled laughter in the walls, echoes of bedtime stories, the quiet scurry of small socks across hardwood. In the hallway, just below the new smoke detector and beside the thermostat, a small copper plaque was mounted. Simple engraving, no corporate branding, just 2 words, "Heat first." He ran a hand over the brass. The thermostat ticked softly as warm air whooshed through the vents. The windows were cracked open just slightly, letting the sweet scent of thawed pine drift in. The sun touched the couch where Piper had once curled up, exhausted and scared. Now it was just a couch again, one she'd jump on the moment she got home from school. Garrett crossed the room, took a deep breath, and let the warmth settle in his chest. It was no longer just a house, and he was no longer just the man who owned it. He was the man who opened the door, and in doing so, had opened something far greater within himself. The storm was over, and the air was warm. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, we invite you to stay with us. Because here at Restoring Tales, every story reminds us that love, kindness, and second chances still exist. There are more tales waiting, of resilience, of hope, and of quiet heroes among us. So, if you believe in the healing power of love and the beauty of life's small moments, be sure to subscribe to Restoring Tales and turn on notifications. Because the next story might be the one your heart's been waiting for. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.